actual phosphorus TMDL. Here, I'll show you, share my screen. Oh, here we go. So it's actually this here, the phosphorus TMDL for Vermont. It's the June 17th, 2016. And come back to, I'll share that again and again in a second. I just don't want to make anybody dizzy as I go scrolling through this thing. But there's actually references made in a couple different places, both in this document and in another one that talks about the ability to be able to do reallocations, but in doing so, it doesn't sound like it sounds like there's already an established procedure for that that's on the books through the state. And so I just want to bring that up because I know up to this point, I think there's been some suggestions of reopening the TMDL, and I don't know that that's really necessarily what the goal is. I think the idea was just to try to find if can we reallocate any of these reductions, and if we can look at that without having to open up, the whole thing. I think that meets both concerns. Both the concerns, the opportunity to be able to reallocate, and also the concerns about not wanting to reopen the actual TMDL as a whole. The other thing I noted from that document was that the wastewater treatment facilities are actually included, at least the way I'm reading it, are actually included in the developed lands allocations for reductions, with only really one facility being a significant contributor of phosphorus, and that being the Burlington plant, who did just get a pretty large bond passed for upgrades. Now, that's not a conversation I'd really want to open up without talking to talking to Burlington or Megan Moore, finding out, what some of those upgrades they're looking at might include, but it seems like we'd be missing an opportunity to not have that conversation, or maybe even the state should be having that conversation.
I do think a few things to share. My understanding is wastewater treatment facilities are part of the waste load allocation, but developed lands is sort of a different part of the waste load allocation. So you've got wastewater treatment facilities, and then you have developed lands, which includes both roads and non-road segments. I think there's a few more in there. So they're not, the methodology of them are a little bit different. Let's see, waste load is wastewater, developed lands, excluding back roads, which is MS4 permits, individual permits, MSG, back roads, which is MRGP, combined sewer overflows, and CAFOs. So similar, but not exactly the same. My understanding, there is like an established rule for how within wastewater treatment facilities they can reallocate load, and then it gets documented in their permits. I think it's a very old rule, like from the 1980s, but I do think it's used. I don't know we'd have to follow up with those folks, unless Terry, you know more. But it's just within the realm of wastewater treatment facilities, not exchanging that across that and developed lands in terms of having established process. The TMDL does also articulate like EPA's support for trading, both within the waste load and across the waste load and load allocation, but points to a lot of other EPA policy in terms of establishing a very formal trading mechanism for that. So that is, I don't know if that's something that can be framed up this year, but could be something to point to in future years, right? To see can these utilities right now focus on the acute issue of 3 acre, and over time the state launches a trading program and now they can resolve or manage their permit obligations with a broader suite of tools via a trading mechanism. So we could kind of talk about phasing in design and recommendations as well.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to see where I highlighted it, and I'm not seeing now where the where it looked like from the actual TMDL document here that the wastewater treatment facilities were included in the develop because it was developed lands as part of the point sources, and then you had your agriculture and then your non-point forests and stream banks. It's where I guess, and that's why it's good to have these conversations because the way I read it, maybe somebody else reads it differently, but um, maybe something I guess I don't want to close the door on any options at this point. Um, but that's a little bit outside of where we are and what we need to talk about in this chapter two, which is specific to setting up a regional, you know, uh,
I thought the speakers were interesting last week, but I felt like it was not quite the model we would need. It would seem like we would want to be based on watershed areas because we don't have strong county government here. And what I found really interesting was how they don't charge municipalities. And I think that would have to be really thought through on, because a lot of, in our town, the HOAs are a combination of residential and municipal streets. So, how do you deal with that and charge for the maintenance, for instance, of the detention ponds or retention ponds? So it seemed like it was good information, but we would have to tackle it differently here because of the way our governments, work. And then I wasn't clear if we did something like that regionally, how would it work? What would the town then be responsible for? Or would they be responsible for anything? Would they also, like I said, maybe just pay for their streets and roads, but not pay, not have their own utility? And that was a little gray to me, how that would all work. Because it seemed like the towns and municipalities still had their own utility, even though there was a regional district. And the regional district only did the big picture items, not the specific items. But anyway, that was my takeaway from last week.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing this. Are there other thoughts from the presentation last week?
I'd love to offer a few if I may.
Yeah, please.
I too found it really interesting, and I think I fully agree, Luce, that that model probably wouldn't be really effective for us for some of the reasons you've laid out and maybe others. I am happy to also hear that you might still be willing to entertain a watershed-based type structure because I think for us that would be the most effective. I also found it interesting. A couple things that kind of stuck in my mind was how they went about undertaking some kind of real initiative projects to kind of demonstrate that they, can actually get some things done. And they pointed out to two of them that I recall them discussing. One would be like stream bank erosion because of some, real significant river erosion kind of conditions that they were dealing with. I remember seeing some pictures of, what it might look like after the fact kind of thing. And I was like, that's interesting. And then the other one was a large culvert under what sounded like a larger highway, right? She described an arterial road, which would be for us more like a state highway. And I didn't really get a chance to ask the question, but I'm saying to myself, okay, so how is this stormwater utility undertaking infrastructure associated with state highways? And it made me think that that's also not really something that probably would be Vermont applicable. But then I also said to myself, we all drive by these rivers and streams where these stream bank erosion conditions exist. And even if we had an effective and established stormwater utility, and they want to take on that scale of a job for a signature project of how we're going to, do something to really have a positive effect on sediment transport. I don't think that we could get it permitted in our state through the rivers side of the silos. And I live on the Winooski River just above the Bolton Dam. And just before COVID, uh, the Green Mountain Power had to secure a clean water certification to obtain their FERC licensing for redoing the electric potential on Bolton Dam. That clean water certification somehow required them to basically lower the normal ponded water elevation behind Bolton Dam by about 6 feet. It's just created horrendous stream bank stabilization conditions for thousands of feet, including along my property. It's drained wetlands. Um, and I say to myself, okay, you guys probably drive by it where the snowmobile bridges cross the Winooski River on Route 2, right? Just look at what's going on there. We want a signature project. Let's propose that be a signature project, but I don't think we could get it permitted.
I was interested in the permitting dynamics. I know they hadn't included other MS4s at the time, but we're talking, I thought it was really interesting, or what I heard them say is that they do not assume, I don't know, they were really sensitive around the language. Like they were not the permittee, the MS4 permittee, but through a series of MOUs and legal documents, they were implementing a lion's share or a select portfolio of obligations for the MS4s, and that they could do that. They could replicate that at scale. And so that was something I was curious about when thinking about a regional stormwater utility. And we talked a little bit last time about like what's in, what's out, does this utility manage the town roads? No, that's, town by town, but what would happen to MS4s? And could that be a model for, I don't know, particularly since the MS4 is like a NEPDs, you all know better than I do, like a federal permit. Are there obligations to keep it at the municipal level, but be able to offload a set of obligations to the regional? So I don't know, there was some interesting stuff in there, and I was curious with those with more experience in the MS4 space, their takeaways or thoughts.
Well, it's been a quick minute since I've really gotten into the NIPDs for MS4s. Mostly because I've never really seen them apply into that. Those regulations really apply into, well, they don't usually apply too much when it's delegated authorities because the baseline requirements are there. But the minimum thresholds, and Terry, maybe you can help clarify this, my understanding is the only reason why we have these MS4 permits right now is because of state policy, not because of EPA's, not because of NIPD's policies.
Well,
Because
we don't meet the population criteria for the federals, right? A lot of them.
So
Right.
I did check in with Christy Witters on that, and I think the distinction she made was, the population was based on the overall, I think she referred to it as the metropolitan area or whatever the term is used. So that wasn't strictly town by town or city by city based. So I am not the expert on MS4 jurisdiction. I'm not claiming to be, but I'm just reporting what her take on that was.
yeah, and I don't think we meet the density either, but
And yeah, there may be more to it than just that, but that was one piece that she noted. But that's really her permit. I mean, I certainly know of it and how it interacts with more on the operational permitting side and so on, but the details are not my area of expertise.
Well, the MS4 has 6 criteria, right? I don't know if you're familiar with that. And there's
Mhm.
2 of them that are public education and public participation.
Mhm.
And then there's where you have to have good housekeeping of your municipal streets and roads and also being sure that you watch on construction sites that are being developed in your town, that you pay attention, there's no erosion going from, not just erosion, but, contributing particles. So I don't know if you could split up some of those to a regional level. But I guess my ultimate dream would be you would have regional by watersheds and they would prioritize not just 3-acre sites, but maybe some non-3-acre sites that we have, for instance, in our town that were older, that a straight pipe to McCabe Brook, which is an impaired waterway. So they would look at the whole region and say, where's the most reduction in phosphorus that we can get for the dollars we have to spend? And I guess that would be my ultimate goal, right? It would be being very efficient and saying what makes sense. We just spent about 300,000 on redoing one of the detention ponds with a state grant in our town, but you didn't get a lot of return on your money. So, is that what we should have spent it on? I'm grateful the town didn't have to pay for it, but that's where I would hope a region would say, let's look at these different 3-acre sites, non-3-acre sites, and figure out where the best project would be.
Yeah,
Do
I
we-
agree. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask if this, I don't know if this subgroup has this knowledge, or if Terry, this is something to confirm with Christy and Emily, the bit, like, I think on the 3-acre side, because it's state-ish permit, we are exploring other ways to achieve those reductions. And I'm not sure or clear if we have that flexibility with the MS4s. And so do we know that for sure? Can we like absolve an MS4 or absorb it, or do we? And so maybe this is like a next step in terms of learning more in the space, unless that's already crystal clear for everyone but myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think Christy would be the best one to address that. I mean, yeah, I mean, we could ask her to put something in writing. Initially, this was just a brief, I brought it up in a meeting we were having, and she said a few things, but yeah, if we wanted to address that, what could be feasible under a utility approach, what would be less likely to be feasible with regards to the overall MS4 structure and how things work there. I think with the whole phosphorus reduction, the accounting for that, and how, if an MS4 takes over a 3-acre site, that's a little bit more well understood by myself. Just, it's been more in my wheelhouse, but the other parts of it are less so.
Okay. Something to flag.
May I offer a follow-up to that one? Luce, I love what you described there. I'd like to offer that if we're able to get to a watershed approach, as a kid from the Battenkill River down in southwestern Vermont, their, most significant challenge might be more associated with nitrogen and dealing with New York State and the Hudson River. And I think that that's probably true for many of our Connecticut River watershed regions also. So if we're able to stick with watershed regions, the kind of the watershed districts that we already have established kind of segue nicely into that. And there could be different needs, different standards, different criteria that come out for, whatever the needs are for those districts too. It doesn't necessarily just have to do with phosphorus and Lake Champlain.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of that. And again, why I really want to look, I think that looking at the watershed approach is really, I think, makes a lot of sense here, because when really looking at the TMDL and where all the sources are coming from, they're pretty spread out, right? When you have northern sections of the lake, really have high concentrations. Well, let me see here. So, you know, over total overall. So Missisquoi Bay is like 64% of the total reductions needed. Port Henry's 55, South Lake 55. It's so broken out, and the targets that need to be met are so broken out. I think this across this big umbrella approach is really bringing a lot of permittees in that don't need to be in, that don't need to be making these upgrades, because they're not going to have significant impacts to the reductions that we need to meet. So I think that really looking at the regional approach would allow, and we have these. We have our stormwater, or our watershed master plans that are looking at and evaluating our current status in meeting our reductions, and where are the opportunities. I mean, these master plans are looking at this in great detail every 5 years, and but we're not really talking about setting ourselves up and following through with that more. I think we're putting a lot of effort in too many different baskets here.
I mean, just to jump on this, what Christine said, I think the way that I envision this committee is kind of looking at what's the smallest incremental change that might be made that would offer an opportunity for parties that are interested in working together on a project that might be watershed specific, that might be municipality specific, to access funds and to approach projects in a concerted way that worked for them. And then, as I think Gianna, you said, maybe it could be expanded later. I think that because of the complexity of the situation, trying to solve for all possible situations is just going to be frustrating and difficult. Yet at the same time, and again, this is why I always come back to the concentric circles diagram. If we talk about that biggest circle, that's the one where pretty clearly that's beyond the scope of what we can manage with this subcommittee right now and reopening the TMDL. And I mean, I think it would be great, but I think it's not an efficient use of our time. But within the two farther in circles, there may be some opportunities. And, to me, the question is, you have a statute that allows a municipality to take on the liability, but then what's the incentive to do so? And how can we create some probably both monetary and legal incentives where it would be worthwhile for some of these perhaps orphan 3-acre sites to get absorbed into a larger entity? And I think if we could come up with a model that has the flexibility to accommodate different sizes of regional entities, that would be great, because maybe there is a municipality, maybe there is an existing clean water service provider that wants to take this on, that would be willing to if the funding was there. So it's more like, what could we do that it would actually make that voluntary commitment more likely and more attractive? The other thing I wanted to mention, probably not all that helpful, but because Lake Champlain spans New York as well, I was in a conference this week with New York, watching a presentation on the New York State Facilities Corporation, which is the vehicle that New York uses to funnel a lot of these clean water funds. And I asked the question as to whether there had ever been a watershed approach used there, and there has not been in New York. I don't know whether there has been anywhere else, as has been discussed. They do have very robust county government, and a lot of the counties are the ones that are involved in New York. But I thought that was interesting. I love the watershed approach. It may make it more complex. But again, if we could set up the start small approach that would allow something to work within a watershed, potentially to work within other existing watershed models, maybe it could evolve in a way that attracted others if it was successful.
Well, one way to start small would be to maybe gather the projects that are on the MS4 lists and see which ones are in related watersheds, because they are, and then decide which one makes the most sense to do, if all of them do. And if you have state funding for that, then, then you're not pitting one town against the other. You're doing the best that you can to reduce the most. And phosphorus is the biggest concern right now on the Lake Champlain side. I know there's other issues in the Connecticut River, but so, that's a possible way to maybe do it, especially if it's state funded. Right now, every town that has an MS4 is just going by themselves, trying to be the first one at the gate to get the money, even if it may not mean the best reduction using those funds. And I would think we could at least compile that. I think, Terry, when I asked, we don't have a compiled list by basin, right, of all the projects, as far as I know. We don't.
For MS4, I mean.
Yeah.
There's I know you don't want to go to the watershed, but the watershed management plan identifies all the high priority potential projects that should need to get addressed. I know we have like our own phosphorus reduction plans, our phosphorus control
Right.
plans, PCP.
We do too.
And our flow restoration plan. Here's the thing is that we're going to meet ours. If we get this last project through, which we're pretty close to getting across the line, we have one more project and we're done. We meet all of our reductions. And the challenge with I think looking at the MS4s, we're a small little boundary, right? We have a small little boundary. We're going to meet our threshold. We don't touch anything outside of our community, anything in Richmond. So the resident that was talking to us from Richmond, who's struggling, is not going to get that support. Richmond doesn't have the staffing to give that support. So we're going to lose the opportunity to really have the impacts that we actually need to have in order to meet the reductions we need to meet if we don't start looking outside of these small pockets of utilities that are already existing through the MS4 platform. I think that's my concern. And I understand what you're saying, Jenny, to like take a small bite, but I think we are here because we keep trying to put band-aids over bad policy. And just we have to do so. We have to change it, and we don't have to make a big change. I think there's a lot of the infrastructure is already there. I think you look at the clean water service providers, you already have so that infrastructure is already there. You already have the watershed management plans that are going on. The state's been studying those and setting those up. So there's already the research and the infrastructure and staffing there to identify the projects that are needed in each watershed. There's already clean water service providers in these watersheds. It just seems to me that we need to just bring these two together and give the clean water service providers a little bit more authority. You could even leave the MS4s alone and come back to that conversation at a later date. But we're not going to capture a lot of these 3 acres or a lot of these larger, the areas outside of where utilities are. And I think if we look at it in that narrow of a scope and we just look for MS4s, I don't think there's a chance that we're going to meet our reductions. And I think that. And I did look at that. I did find that, Gianna, you're right. That was a specific to the reallocation was specific to wastewater treatment facilities. But I would think that it's worth a conversation to see if that's something that can be applied. And I kind of find the exact language, but I felt like there was language in this TMDL that suggested that reductions in other part of the watershed could be obtained. We just need to be able to demonstrate that we can get those reductions, from projects that are not 3 acres. the other thing I would suggest is actually going out and doing some direct sampling of these facilities. I mean, there was one testimony that was given that, their soils they don't have high phosphorus concentrations in their soils based on the soil content. There was a quarry that was being pulled into a 3-acre permit. These are facilities that are having to spend a lot of money where we may not be getting any reductions. And so I just think that this really, broad umbrella approach is in the attempt to be equitable is really, it's really not getting to the root concerns. But I think if you're looking at your clean water service providers, if you're looking at the ability to look at where we can get reductions in other parts of the same watershed, and I think that you open up the ability to actually do some direct testing at these facilities to determine whether or not these facilities are actually contributing significant loads, I think is important. Stone did a study, and pull it up here, but they did a study that as part of this TMDL that identified that there are areas of concentrated areas. Oh, here it is. I'll share this with you because I think this is really what it kind of comes down to. Much greater than average phosphorus loads can be generated from small pockets of land the EPA's modeling was unable to detect due to the relatively coarse modeling scale. And by focusing on the critical source areas and additional other areas, they will be able to achieve greater reductions than those estimated by the EPA. And this is where I think that there were permittees that were asking to be able to test out of the requirement to make improvements to their systems because they had very good reasons to believe that they were not contributing much to the phosphorus load, but they were going to have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to make upgrades to their system. And for what?
Christine, I just
Yep.
wanted to note one thing with the language. Is this just talking about the Missisquoi Bay segment or like the whole Lake Champlain Basin?
This is Missisquoi Bay. It
Okay,
is,
but-
but I would say that okay, I'll go ahead, Terry. What's your thought here?
No, I mean, I just wanted to get the context. I can understand the point being made, but I think within the TMDL, though this language in particular was focused just on Missisquoi, where, as you noted previously, the reductions are expected to be to need to be greater than in many other segments. But I think overall the TMDL may allow for some flexibility there with looking at certain other areas to achieve the reductions. But I think that I just wanted to confirm this statement in particular was just looking at the Missisquoi.
Yeah, the reason why I highlight it though, and I understand that it's just within the one watershed, the language that I'm flagging there is talking about the course modeling scale that was used by the EPA versus the really understanding boots on the ground, as it's often said. The state says, we know our community better than the state does, right? And I would say the same would be true with the clean water service providers and watershed basins and the watershed management plans, that there are likely small pockets of land that are higher contributors to these phosphorus loads where we could be and should be focusing. And if we were to take that approach, I don't think it's unreasonable to say, here's how we can give assurance that we're going to make our target reductions, because going after lands that actually don't contribute much phosphorus doesn't make sense. And if we're just looking at telling current operators to make improvements because of modeling based on very broad and very diverse information, I mean, it's I don't
It's
see
not
that
getting
it's
it
going to
done.
work. It's not getting it done, and we're going to end up being right back where we are. And that's my concern is more about we're going to spend millions and millions of dollars and spend years on this work. We're going to get to 2033 and we're going to have to do this all over again.
May I add a little onto that thought, please? I think that this really does highlight an important point. Approaching these problems with a regional entity up there is possible. It's at least something that could be really looked at. St. Albans MS4 cannot take on that approach.
No.
And
St.
a
Albans is
regional watershed-based utility potentially could.
Can I share? As you were speaking, I was doing some real Picasso work over here, and I think that um, we're talking along the same lines in terms of envisioning this entity, and just want to maybe do it visually to make sure. So I know this is fantastic, but imagine that this is a watershed, right? And so, I mean, loosely based on the Winooski, we've got the lake over on the left. This is the Winooski watershed going from right to left. And you've got like the green is the forested land. The yellow is maybe some ag land. The pink is some developed centers. And then the red is regulated developed areas. So like the MS4 or like speckle in there a few like 3-acre spots here, a 3-acre spot here. I'm fairly confident we've all talked about and are on a similar page of envisioning an entity that serves the whole watershed, potentially raises fees from the whole watershed based on impervious acre or whatnot. We can see what comes out of Chapter 3 working group. And then is seeking the most cost-effective ways to meet waste load allocation reductions. So obviating the need for this little red dot here and this little red dot here and this little red dot here, and adding together, that's 1,000 kilograms of phosphorus. I don't know. These are all just made up, 100 kilograms. And instead we take them away from those 3 red dots, and across this entire landscape, this utility is seeking ways to otherwise reach that reduction. And I think part of the rub with the TMDL is how can they reach that reduction? And what seems pretty firm is that we can't really dabble into the types of projects or regions that we're otherwise telling EPA we're meeting on the load allocation side. So we can meet this 100 in all the other pink. It doesn't have to be within the boundaries of the MS4. It can be any other developed land, but we're challenged to meet this reduction by doing a stream restoration project or a forest restoration project now. But what we could contemplate in a report and a recommendation is like, well, let's start small. Let's start with like adopting these 3 red dots, assigning 100 kilograms to a regional entity, and saying find the most cost-effective ways to implement across the pink, the developed land in the waste load allocation. And trading would get us even cheaper options. And like that's a huge effort in itself, but we also recommend that as a longer term place to go. So because what I'm hearing, some of what you're saying, Christine, is concern that we would just look in the MS4 boundary, and I don't think that's what we're trying to articulate. You'd still like fee raise across the watershed and look for solutions, but the solution right now would be restricted to stormwater-esque STPs, things that treat developed land runoff.
So yeah, so my concern with the umbrella approach that the 90/50 is taking right now, right? And reason why, again, I really think it needs to be watershed based and regional. And I think that I think expanding the authorities of the clean water service providers, and I think we should bring one or two of them in to get their thoughts on that and their ability to carry that increased capacity. I'm going to share again here, real quick, is that where we need to get our reductions is not consistent. So a general permit that applies to the state, even though it's broken out to watershed and non-watershed, outside the watershed, and the timeframes of meeting these objectives, the reductions are not the same across each of the watersheds, right? And so these are the different areas, and I think that, go chasing after any 3-acre sites in Port Henry may not be the best option, or better yet, the main lake, where you have to have 61% reductions from our wastewater, with 20 in our developed lands, right? But Burlington Bay has a higher reduction it needs to obtain from developed lands. The goals are just not, because they're not consistent across the entire watershed of the lake. It doesn't make sense to try to set up a general permit that forces developed lands to meet these BMP standards. I'm afraid we're going to invest a lot of money and not get what we're looking for out of it as results. That's kind of where I'm coming from with that.
Christine, so that table that you were sharing, that's the percentage reduction from each sector within each of those specific watersheds. I think there is, I've been trying while we're talking, but I haven't been successful in finding that same document. I think there's a separate table that says what percentage of the required reduction comes from each sector within each watershed. And that I think might be really useful because, Gianna, thank you for sharing your trying.
I think, is that not it? I mean,
no, because that's what percentage reduction. So basically what this is saying is within the wastewater sector, the main lake segment has to reduce its phosphorus by 61%. So all of the agricultural ones, except for Burlington Bay, have to reduce their agricultural production area discharges by 80%. That doesn't mean that 80% of Burlington Bay's, or that bad example of Shelburne Bay's, reductions come from agricultural production areas, but I think there's a separate table that shows that.
Okay, all right, yep, I know what you're asking for now.
But I do think it's a really interesting question, because if you go with Gianna's model, so say we're looking at Winooski, I think that what Gianna was saying is, say there's these 3 little dots, which are 3-acre sites, not the MS4s, not the big circles, because we can't do anything with those. But if there are specific regulatorily required reductions that have to happen, but that there's a larger pink area within which there could be reductions, would it make sense on a watershed by watershed basis to allow flexibility for some watershed based entity to have the ability to absorb those 3-acre, not the MS4, but just the 3-acre sites, and to make those reductions elsewhere within that watershed based geographic area? And I think that would be a really interesting approach. And I think because of these tables, it may be more or less feasible based on what's the amount of developed lands, what's the proportion of developed lands that's contributing. But it might maybe give some ability to align the non-regulatory and the regulatory reductions in a way that optimally allows some funding to go to kind of a greater good type of project, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah,
I-
I think this is the one you were looking for, where the allocations, like, so the total loading capacities, and then, so from the waste load allocation from developed lands and these different sections, and what they're broken out for, including our margin of safety, 5%. So right. So with agriculture, so the waste load allocation for production areas and the percentages of that versus, um, you know, its current load allocation versus what needs to get reduced.
So I'm going to recommend an action item, and I don't know who would do it, and maybe I'm not volunteering myself, I hope, but where we take one watershed and we look at the towns in that area, we look at the 3-acre sites and we do a cross list, and to see, and I know in our town, we've applied for a lot of the permitting, which means we should have a very rough estimate of the phosphorus reduction. And we could see, what does this look like?
Well, that should be an
Is
easy
that
lift for
something
the
A&R can
state.
help
Yeah.
us with, or do we
Yeah.
need to do that as committee members?
Yeah, I love that idea. And Luce, I really loved your idea too about the MS4s. Even if MS4s aren't the way that we're going, I like the idea of trying to just look at data and see what's out there, what are the reductions that are coming within a particular watershed, and how can you look at them in a way where they're not competing with each other within that watershed, but rather collaborating to have the most kind of cost-effective reductions within that watershed.
So we have a utility, stormwater utility in our town, and I know not all towns do. And so people do pay based on impervious area into that utility. And that could be, like you said, chapter 3, a potential funding source. Maybe the region gets 80% of the money, or, I'm just throwing a number out, or they get a percentage of the number. And the rest stays with the town to do their own maintenance on their elements that they need to do. But, and then, yeah, just would have to think about how this would all work. But anyway, that's just a thought to start to see if this even makes any sense. Do we have some examples of, yes, here's a list of projects in this particular watershed. And right now it looks like these are ready for funding. These aren't, but they would provide better results. So maybe the funding should move to those.
Yeah, I don't know how the data would be broken up. I don't manage it, but we're required to track phosphorus reductions. Our department, not again, me, our little section of permitting folks, but others in our program, and even including others outside of our program probably. So I think we can get some useful data there.
I mean,
And
it's-
when we say watershed, do we mean just Lake Champlain lake segment, or just more straight watershed, like this river, this particular watershed area, regardless of lake segment?
Yeah, we have like 15 watersheds, right, in Vermont right now, watershed basins. So they're already delineated. So
Basins,
why not use
basins,
that?
yeah.
And, I've looked at the annual report that gives you your reductions that you believe you've accomplished. And those change. Sometimes they're better after a year and you've gotten some monitoring. I haven't seen detailed information, but you probably have, or A&R has that somewhere in order to generate that report. But yeah.
I mean,
So-
and maybe what we could do is pick, because I do like the idea of looking at the entities that already exist as clean water service providers. So just to start off, like, I like your idea, Lucia, just like pick one or two, maybe like, maybe not Chittenden County, but maybe one of the other ones that does run into Lake Champlain, and just see what it looks like when you look at those projects that are the voluntary projects, and then also look at the reductions that are happening because they're required within that watershed.
Yeah, so thank you for whoever put the watershed project database up. That's what I was looking for. But please correct me if I'm wrong, but were you trying to get an idea of like like a map that mapped, like a visual of map with the 3-acre sites and where they actually are located, so that we could see within the political boundaries where they're located? Is that what you were asking for?
Well, no, I was looking for, the 3-acre sites within one particular watershed area. And then you
Sure.
would determine which ones, because when you apply for your permit, like we've
Yep.
applied, I think, for all of ours and our town, but you're waiting for the state to confirm what you've estimated, right, for reductions. So that would be a starting point. Here's the projects. And, and maybe in our watershed, it's Richmond and Shelburne and South Burlington. And you take a look at all these projects and you say, wow, and there's also cost estimates already provided, but those are tough right now in the market. So it's not just looking at 3 acre sites, it's looking at them in one particular watershed and what is the best results again for the dollars.
So, I mean, this information is already available. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this map. It's similar to what
Right.
we were just looking at, but it's pretty comprehensive on what's been identified for projects to get these reductions.
There is,
But does
yeah,
it give
so
you the cost estimate and the estimated phosphorus removal with that?
This in our for the non-regulatory side, we fund everything from finding stormwater projects through stormwater master planning, like a voluntary stormwater master planning effort where we partner with towns, explore all the different opportunities for stormwater projects, rank them based on phosphorus reduction potential, cost estimate, et cetera, and then start to move those through at least 30%, like the top 5 through the 30% design. We also fund 30% design, 100% design, and implementation, both through the clean water service providers and through our enhancement block grants. And so the database that I was sharing with you is a part of a massive effort by our watershed planners to track project opportunities across the state, across different sectors, stormwater, wetlands, rivers, etc. Sometimes we have cost estimates. Sometimes you need to get it to 100% design before we have a cost estimate, or sometimes that project has gone fallow for 10 years, so the cost estimate can be outdated. So we don't have a statewide or Lake Champlain wide list of all possible stormwater project opportunities and their costs. We do our best to see, based on partners' ability and willingness to scope for some of that. So I think that the watershed projects database, you can search by proposed stormwater project, and it's a list of 2,000. So these are all potential project opportunities. Who knows the landowner willingness, the potential costs, there's a lot that's involved in that. We also have all the 3 acre lists that you could sort by town or county. And I think part of the effort in this chapter is to really articulate how you take a 3 acre site and translate that to a phosphorus reduction target. So that's some of the effort there. But then I think I'm struggling to really understand what evaluation you'd want to see, but for seeing there's a lot of developed land in this area, and not all of it is currently subject to 3 acre or MS4.
Right.
And so it's really the stuff that's not subject to it that is the landscape potential. And there's a suite of potential project opportunities, but also feasibly this utility would fund more scoping and more stormwater master planning and more feasibility assessments on that. So I don't know if it's the list of projects that helps with that analysis so much as what are the acres of land in each of these watersheds that are not under 3 acre and MS4 that could present landscape opportunities for treatment.
Maybe it's 2 phases. So the first phase is you use the 3 acre sites that are well identified and a lot of the permits have been applied for. So you have a lot of information, including some preliminary cost estimating. So that's the first thing we could do, is compare the 3 acre sites that are within one watershed and see what makes the most sense to construct. And then the next phase would be, okay, we all know about areas that they didn't have a stormwater permit way back when, so they're not on the 3 acre set, but they're also, causing some pollution. To me, that would be a next step, because that's much more involved because we don't have that data.
Yeah, I think it's a good flag. Some of these 3 acre projects may actually happen on those 3 acre sites. I think some of this assumption is that they wouldn't, that we have to always find an offset opportunity, but maybe, sorry, I'm not exactly what you're saying, but maybe speaking back what I'm hearing you say is a reminder that if we were to look at how a utility would find project opportunities, you wouldn't have to exclude the existing 3-acre sites in that landscape because some of them may very well end up hosting projects. They just need the financial assistance to host that project and move it forward. So is there still a data ask here? And I want to make sure we understand what it is. Is there...
Janet, did you say that there's a database that has potential projects that nobody has submitted? Or that is
Well,
it, or
I wouldn't say nobody has submitted. I would say potential projects that are sort of the next phase coming out of something that we funded. So if we fund a stormwater master plan, we're funding someone to drive around a town, be like, look at these 50 great ideas. And like we take those 50 great ideas and we pump them into this database, and the top 5 moved on to preliminary design, and the other 45 are like potential design project opportunities.
got it. So basically, you guys are funding master planning. You take the data generated by the master plan and kind of filter it through prioritization, and some of it is actually already funded and already happening. And then there are other projects that were identified that maybe could be done. So, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and we have a narrow lens of just what we fund, right? There's a lot of partners out there just doing this work out of their own interest or finding other grants to fund. So we do our best to say, like, let us know, but that can be a resource. And this does not
because there's like
capture...
basin program funding, and like I'm aware of stuff that's happened where people are applying for that.
And this particular dashboard doesn't list out all the projects in the PCPs. I don't, maybe. I think we're working towards actually using the database a bit more for the MS4 project tracking. So that gets you to a landing page. And the third link down is the database search tool. And the second link down was the one that Christine was sharing. It's a little bit clunky, and the map only updates once a year from our other data, so it's not as refreshing. It's not refreshing in terms of data immediacy.
So what's our next steps as a committee here?
Yeah, I'm thinking about like, what is the ask? Because I feel like I spend all of these meetings trying to click on the links and look at the data, and it might be really helpful if A&R could generate just some type of a prototype. And I think, Luce, you described it better than anyone, so that we could understand kind of what might the data ask be that would support ultimately the legal structure that perhaps the study committee might recommend, if that makes any sense. So maybe a little bit of a narrative that explains or kind of guides, or a flow chart or something that would guide through, like, were there to be the opening of availability of funds to just say, hypothetically, the clean water service provider entity to kind of take on this new role of finding and moving forward with projects that might do what we've been talking about. So like potentially shift some of the 3-acre projects to happening on other sites that would overall more cost effectively result in phosphorus reductions. Like, what might the data system look like to support that entity doing it? I don't know if that makes any more sense than what anybody else has said.
Well, and just thinking about the data, it sounds like, so the state comes out with some perhaps top level after meeting with the town, doing a master planning. Here's what we feel the projects that are going to give us really good results. How can we compile that? And maybe it is compiled, I don't know, but how can we compile that watershed wise to say, hey, look, the state, these are just very preliminary ideas, but the state feels these have very good merit. So let's look at those projects for the watershed. And what does that mean? and how do we move forward? That's kind of, you know, that's not just 3 acre, that's whatever the projects that you came up with as you helped people with the master planning. I just don't know if that's already compiled by the state. It's not clear to me if it is anywhere.
There's a couple different things I'm hearing, so I just trying to, Jenny, part of your ask of like, what would a data system look like? We do have, like the clean water service providers have their tracking for how we document their phosphorus reduction targets year over year, how we allocate their awards based on the different like sectors they have to reduce by and their average dollar per kilogram we expect them to reduce by, and then they report back out the projects. We have standard accounting for how we account for the phosphorus reduction for those projects. So there's like how much time you got. Like our data systems are really robust for the QUISP piece of it. There's a nugget in there I am curious about and am hesitant about, like de facto assuming the QUISP entity. Like I realize there's an attractiveness to a pre-existing entity and they are assigned load allocation reductions. And if we assign them waste load allocation reductions, these load allocation reductions over here are underfunded. We don't give them enough money to achieve that. So if we give this waste load, so if we increase their obligations and then they're self-raising money, it almost feels like a different set of books and a different set of tracking. And like, this is waste load, this is a permit, a NEPTES permit. And like that, those mechanics and the data structure might be very different to the pre-existing. So maybe that can be housed in a QUISP, or maybe that has to be housed in a separate entity. I don't know that answer, but there is a unique set of questions here that I think would be important to have clear eyes on if an entity is absorbing the 3 acre obligations. Like what? Are they holding the permit? Are they like the responsible party now? Like those sorts of pieces I have questions about. How they then achieve that phosphorus reduction, I think we already have planned in the outline to articulate how other entities do that. We can articulate how the MS4s as a model have a phosphorus control plan, have a BMP tracking sheet, and how they report, and it estimates the phosphorus reduction, like progress towards achievement. So there are different, and we can report in the report how the QUISPs do that and assign that. So we have examples of how that could happen if assigned a waste load allocation reduction. I don't know if that's.
I guess I just don't see much of a difference between what you're doing with the QUISP and what you're doing asking for the MS4s, except for the fact that they're in 2 different categories. To me, they're pretty similar. You have a project, you have a potential reduction in phosphorus that comes from implementing that project. You identify it, you construct it, you track it, it goes into a database, it gets accounted for. I understand that they are in 2 separate categories, but I mean, they're pretty much, you're pretty much, riding the same bike. One's a mountain bike, one's a road bike, but you're still riding the same bike, right? Which is why it just seems to, why I keep going back to them as being, there's so much infrastructure already there.
Yeah, and not to say that that couldn't be the answer, but to be really careful and clear-eyed about if there are unique differences when you introduce waste load allocation obligations to them. So that's one piece of what I was hearing, Jenny, and I don't know if that.
I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I also think it's really interesting because I think those entities aren't necessarily in the room. And I think it's good to think about, like, we can say, oh, it'd be great to have it be watershed based. And I can understand the reluctance of municipalities to take on additional obligations when their approach has been, well, let's take care of ours, and they're put into this competitive process. And how do you get past that? That's the really difficult question that the committee is tasked with. And I think by asking those questions and even just hearing what you just said, Gianna, about how it's not apples to apples, I think it gives us some useful information about like what it might take to get to a model that is less competitive, more watershed based, because I don't think there is a perfect model that exists right now. And even like New York, like counties aren't perfect either because they're not necessarily aligned with watersheds either. So we're basically talking about creating a new beast, and maybe the way to start would almost be with a pilot to say, okay, let's take one watershed or one whatever they're called for purposes of the TMDL, the different regions, and like what might it look like just within developed lands. But it does get a lot more complicated when it gets to the NPDS permits, and I know for Burlington, because I've just barely looked at some of what Burlington is doing, it's because they have the CSO and it all gets rolled in with the wastewater, and then it becomes much more complicated. So how do you factor for that complexity? Because it all ties in, and part of the complexity is the available funding sources vary between different sectors too, and the criteria are different. And how can you set up a system that doesn't just funnel money to solutions that are not the biggest bang for your buck? I mean, that's the thing that's frustrating about it, is there's only so far you can go with the wastewater treatment, but yet you end up with lots of money going that direction. So I don't have a clear answer, but
Jenny,
maybe setting up a prototype would be helpful.
Jenny, may I offer that listening here today, I want to say that you might have come full circle, because I think I heard earlier on about trying to see about how we can possibly simplify things to advance the 3-acre kind of program as it exists for the TMDL. But now I think you're really kind of recognizing that this is really an opportunity to look at it much broader. I think that that's what I remember hearing Representative North ask in the beginning here. And I think that the fact that really the state, it probably would be a major ask for some of the data analysis that we've just been kicked around. And so the state would, if it's a major ask for the state, the towns can't do it. Hopefully the regions can. And I know that funding is a big piece of it here, but a part of this is the potential for funding as ratepayers, right? And although that might not help our affordability crisis, it will provide a revenue source for an entity to try to really focus on these bigger picture targeted issues. And I don't think we can get there in Vermont at the municipal level. And I think you've almost described that just here this morning, or this afternoon. And this is an opportunity to pull some Band-Aids off and maybe really get some effective in it. And Gianna, if I may offer one comment that when you spoke earlier, you mentioned waste load allocation reductions. I'm hopeful for waste load reductions. This modeling and this tracking of what we think is occurring is all very interesting. It may be what we're legally required to do because of the deal with the EPA, but a regional stormwater utility should have a laboratory set up near the mouth of the river.
Well, there are some right now, Harry, and that was part of the TMDL was supposed to be doing some of that monitoring in different segments of the watershed was called out. And I'm with you, Jenny. I'm tired of seeing good money go to bad projects. And I don't know that I would agree that we're all competing with each other. I don't look at my neighboring communities as my competition. As I said, we are one project away. Our biggest challenge is at MS4 is actually is being constraints from wetlands. I would say wetlands is probably my biggest constraints. It's not funding. It's ability to be able to construct projects in places that there's open space. In places that are downhill from where the development exists. That's my biggest constraint. And as I said, we have one project left that's been constrained by wetlands for the last 7 years. We finally got the blessing from them, showing that, we made some more, continue to make design changes and beg and plea. And so we're one step closer. But once we do that, we're done. We're done. We've met our reductions, right? And then we only have a couple of 3-acre sites within our political boundaries. We're not going to capture so many sites outside of that. And what I think that was really frustrating is that we set all this ARPA money, we put it all into these 3-acre projects across the watershed of the Lake Champlain. But when you look at these different watersheds, the 3 acres developed lands may not be the highest contributing part of the waste load allocation. And so putting money into to the developed lands it may not be it may not be smart use of money. It may not be getting the best bang for the buck. I don't know that you can get the best bang for the buck unless you are actually trying to allocate those funds on a watershed by watershed basis.
I'm not sure if I'm hearing disagreement or agreement in structure, and so I'm just gonna like repeat back out. I think we're in agreement that watershed by watershed knows the area and the community more and is the best way to get a bang for buck. And I think we're kind of looking for that opportunity or contemplating that structure. I do hear it speaking about waste load and load, and so curious if there's still an ask here for an entity to invest in solutions on non-developed lands, or if there's clarity there about how that rubs up against reopening the like, I'm wondering, are we talking about that right now, or are we talking about something different?
Well, if the non-developed lands are some of the priorities you've discussed after you do a municipal master plan, that would be interesting to know. Right? I don't know what the municipal master plan, I guess I'll have to look at some to see what kind of projects are listed.
The MS4s will not include load allocated because
No,
it's
but-
not
but she-
permitted.
Right, but she talked about municipal master planning,
The
Yeah,
municipal master plans sorry, Gianna.
just for MS4s or for,
no, the stormwater master plans, we partner with more urbanized towns to look at their urban developed lands area and find project opportunities. So that would all be waste load allocation stuff that's non-regulatory. That's not that, so project opportunities in the pink on the map, right? And so those are the types of opportunities.
And similarly, kind of going off what Gianna's saying, MS4s have something similar as well. So we have stormwater master plans, which include, targeted projects for flow reduction. So, stream bank stabilization by reducing total peak flows coming off our developed lands. We also have now phosphorus control plans, so looking at phosphorus reductions from those developed lands as well. So I apologize. I didn't realize you were doing master plans with other communities. Would that include like Richmond then, Gianna?
Yeah, I
okay.
think Waterbury's wanted one. Gosh, we've been doing them for years now. I have to look at our full list of who's got a completed stormwater master plan, but
And that sounds like that'd be information that could be shared with a regional stormwater utility to
Mhm.
help streamline. I mean, we have a lot of, I will say, I will give the state credit. I mean, we have a lot of information about project needs.
Mhm.
It's just getting an entity to be able to pursue them. And
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, and just going back to like Luz's question and Jenny's question about like test casing this with data, I'm trying to get maybe a tighter hand around like what we have a list of opportunities in the pink potentially, but presumably a regional utility would continue to build out their master plan of scoping there. We have the total acreage subject to 3 acre or somewhat. And we could maybe figure out total acreage of developed land in a watershed. And just kind of do a comparison of like acres not subject to, but would be in the waste load versus acres subject to, and like, is there enough? Does that expand enough of a landscape of potential opportunity? I don't know if we know what enough is, given that some of those 3 acre sites may still host those projects. So, but we could probably look at those numbers together in some way. If that's helpful for.
I think that would be helpful. And I think that's the best articulation that I've heard. I mean, because it would give us an example to look at, to just understand, at least in that one particular case, what's out there that might be a project that could be done, what's the proportion. And I say keep it within developed lands to start, because it just gets much more complicated if you expand it beyond that. But just looking at developed lands, if you have the 3 acre sites, if you have the potential developed lands project that would be voluntary, like what does that look like in terms of phosphorus reductions, for example? Like not even looking at cost to start, and then look at cost.
We do have like an average kilogram per acre treated assumption somewhere, right, Terry? It might be in our cost rate, part of our
Well,
cost rate. It's so variable, but
In our town phosphorus reduction plan, right, we have the list of the 3 acre sites with the phosphorus that we're anticipating to remove from those.
right.
So any town that has a phosphorus reduction plan has that. I'm sure Williston has that too, and, and Stowe. And so do we even start at least with compiling those, or do you have them compiled? Maybe you do. I don't know.
Terry, I think Emily has given some like draft thoughts about how we would turn 3 acre sites to a phosphorus reduction estimate because she's been doing it for these PCPs. Is that like a plug in the Excel and we can do that across this 750 sites? And you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there is a formula that she has, and I think it might be able to be plugged in terms of impervious acreage for those 3 acre sites, and we could come up with something. I mean, I could certainly run it by her. But I don't know exactly what she's got now or what she's capable of producing in a short period of time, or without asking her to do a ton of research, which she may not. I don't want to get on Emily's bad side. She's important, but I can run it by her. If there's an ask here, she understands what we're doing. She's aware of the utility committee and all that, so I can do it.
I think what we can't get to though, when you're saying like, what are the list of project opportunities, those cost estimates may or may not be there. They may or may not be accurate or current. And we have a very average dollar per acre treated that we see based on all the projects that we've funded over time of what that's looking like. And I don't think what we could compare is like, you don't do the project here at this 3 acre site, but look at all these other acres of opportunity. Would that be more cost effective? That's, I think what's implicit in this, right, is that the utility would do that.
Cost is hard because it's so site specific and variable. You can't just say, well, this site, I mean, generally, yes, a site that has 25 acres of impervious compared to one that has 3.5. But beyond that, it gets more challenging. But yeah, you'd have to you'd have to think about, what type of treatment practices, and all that. So.
Again, I think a lot of this information exists. I pulled up the Winooski watershed plan here, and this is a summary of phosphorus reductions from 2016 to 22 by different sectors. You can kind of see agriculture's reduced a lot, rivers, roads, stormwater. I'm gonna scroll up here real quick because I did want to, this is kind of where I want to look at too. And again, it kind of goes back to the differences in each watershed has different, contributing factors to what's bringing the phosphorus or contributing to phosphorus and where those reductions need to happen. And the state really does have a lot of great information, and it is broken out really, really well defined from watershed to watershed. And I think this is really a good example. And I would say, I would just encourage, taking a few minutes and looking through some of these. I think a lot of the questions that we're asking about data that's available, and I think it's there. But sometimes there's just so much of it, you can get lost and it's.
I mean, this is really interesting because you could create, and this doesn't have the pie chart of like what percentage of the reductions are from agriculture, what percentage are from wastewater, but you could generate it from that.
I mean, it's, yeah, the
from
reduction
that
in carbon.
column. Right.
That's what they have to, yeah.
And I think that is helpful in understanding like bang for your buck. And then also like if you look at developed lands and then you have roads. So that's also, it's like, okay, do you put roads in there? Do you just do stormwater? And then we've got a big number for wastewater, actually. We've got a big number for rivers. But there's an awful lot for agriculture too. I mean, and I think it's interesting. It's interesting for me to be thinking about it is just, again, like where do we put in the money that's actually going to reduce the phosphorus? And then how does it fit in with the overall picture without going back and reopening the TMDL?
I agree.
And
No, and I
think
agree.
that's our challenge. The bang for the buck idea is happening at different scales. And so when we're talking to each other, we're not always talking on the same, like the bang for the buck, when you look across sectors, is like, oh, it's so much cheaper to do something on ag land. And the bang for the buck is it's so much cheaper to do that. But that conversation is the one that makes it difficult because of like where the team does assume those reductions. When you say, okay, we're going to look at developed lands and figure out the bang for the buck, and that like that's at the site by site, project by project scale. And I think what's implicit in this effort is just to say, like, if we can just give you more land base to solve this problem versus your specific HOA, we're going to assume that extra land base, that bigger opportunity, will find something cheaper. And so that we don't have the data at the project by project level for and assume. So when we do this analysis of like test casing this idea, I think it's more about how much more developed land are we opening up by watershed. And so I'm just trying to narrow in on like if that data would be helpful. It's just like the proportion of developed lands in a watershed that is not currently subject to regulation in comparison in ratio to the land that is subject to regulation. And does that double the landscape? And that presumably would double more cost-effective opportunities in some way.
Yeah. I mean, and I know that sounds really small, but it is, if you look at, I think it's the second circle in the concentric circles, which is other projects on developed lands.
Mm-hmm.
It helps you see what that would look like. And I do think that if there's anything constructive to come out of this committee, it would be by starting small. And I think if it could, and again, I do circle back to Representative North because I was so impressed when he came to the first meeting, and I liked hearing from him. I liked that he came to the last meeting. If we could even just focus on the 3-acre and the developed lands and say, is there a way to approach this that actually works better? And you don't have to reopen everything. You don't have to look at every possible thing, but I think that would be worthwhile. So I do think it would be helpful to have that data.
I think the second you do that for 3 acres, you're going to have your 2 acres, your 1 acres, your half acres. Everybody who has it's going to be saying, why not me? Because the costs are significant for all of them.
In terms of retroactively installing like
Well,
retrofits?
if we put a utility together that says we're going to go in and we're going to help take over 3 acre sites, because the cost burden on those permit owners is so burdensome. I would be one of the smaller ones saying, well, wait a minute, it cost us, maybe it didn't cost us $500,000, but $150,000. I mean, any cost, right? The second you do something for one, you're gonna have to do it for the others. They're going to ask for it. I would be.
And that could
Right,
probably
I
be,
mean,
oh, go
there
ahead,
are
Liz.
different groups though on the 3 acre, unfortunately. There's people who are in HOAs and built their stormwater ponds and knew they had a stormwater pond to maintain. And then we have several neighborhoods who were slapped in the face and had no idea that they had even had a stormwater permit and had to renew it. And so, I mean, I see what you're saying, Christine, but this is part of the problem. We have like the woman in Richmond who had no idea, right, that this was going to be coming her way. So that's the challenge, as people are surprised. New developments, yes, you have to plan for stormwater treatment. You have to maintain your systems. It's not a surprise. It's in the HOA fee. But there's neighborhoods that had no idea this was coming their way, had no money set aside for any of this. And I think that's the big challenge. That's why there's been so much publicity about this and negative comments, because they were hit hard without any sense this was coming.
And that's why the equity is so hard with the whole situation, because it's the homeowners that are kind of left holding the bag with it when maybe it was the developer, or maybe it was a long time ago before it was even contemplated. And I think that's challenging. But then there's equities, like even assuming pie in the sky, we get to this wonderful world of having a stormwater utility that's like the folks that presented at our last meeting. You still, if you're looking at the equities, you have to take all of those factors into consideration. And that is complicated.
I'm just saying, having sat in the seat of a utility for the last 5 years, and I've worked with homeowners with all different types of existing, orphaned. Some of them were current, and really systems and permits in all different places. They all want us to take over. And I get calls every year asking us why we took over this one and not that one. Why this one, not that one? We'll take mine over too. And we have our reasons for it. And I go through and I explain it to them. They don't feel it's fair.
Well, I mean, SEMSO had an interesting like set of incomes, and one was like fee for service, and one was the impervious acreage. And so it kind of also gets to the root of like, why is this utility forming? And so a lot of this is the 3 acre because that was a retroactive obligation to meet the rest of the TMDL gap, right? And so that felt uniquely like a thing that the whole basin had to achieve, that was uniquely placed on some sites and landowners in a way that's different from future and new development. And so staging up a new system where we charge all the impervious and we treat stormwater in a like less site by site specific way addresses that, but then having the avenue for MS4s to join, for other operational permits to join and have a fee for service, right? Like there could be ways to address that over, again, like start small, but module it up. Like if this is really running and people see those early wins, maybe it can then take on other permit obligations.
Yeah, and
mean,
I think too, like equity, we're striving for more cost effectiveness and more equity. I'm just looking right at the language from Act 37. Obviously, we want to increase that as much as we can if we could do that with the utility, but realistically, it's you're going to have to get reduction somewhere from some lands that are owned by certain people. And then it's about the funding for that and trying to distribute that out among residents in that watershed perhaps, or with the utility managing it. But yeah, it's well heard that I think, equity is probably never going to be perfect, even with a utility in place.
It
mean-
would be better though, Terry, if we didn't have winners and losers. It would be better if it was across the board and hopefully at a, resulting in a lower utility rate. But the fundamental equity challenge is that, you make calls as to who's in and who's out when you're looking at some of the permitting legacy and history here, right? And some of it is really, really hard for our citizens to accept when the neighbor who has what looks like an industrial building is not in. And so I personally believe the only way we're ever going to really solve this equity problem is for everyone to truly be in. Hopefully it's a low cost per square foot of impervious area. But if we land this ship with people still with, winners and losers still, we're not going to solve that equity problem.
I mean, another option is to fund all the 3-acre sites that had no idea that they were a part of a 3-acre site. You know what I mean? If you state fund them and then you set up the regional utility, because the 3-acre site is helping the TMDLs for the whole area, for the whole state. So you fund those, and then now you've got a clean slate. Okay, now everybody has to pay based on pervious, has to pay for maintenance, has to pay for upgrades. I don't know. But that's been the feeling of it's been unfair to people who had no clue that they needed a neighborhood association. And they're wondering
Okay.
why they're paying to clean up the lake and no one else is, or not many people are.
So proposing like some kind of statewide or basin-wide fee collected at the state to cover the roughly $250 million gap. I appreciate that. I mean, I guess I want to understand, like, I think that's the challenge we started with, is that there's not enough at the state level, and a regional entity both knows the projects and can regional revenue raise. But it's not off the table, right? I mean, I think their Chapter 3 group is looking at the state funding structures and asking, like, what are the ways that the state funding can plug in or be restructured to support it in a better way?
I think the challenge with the 3 acres right now, though, and this whole who's in, who's out, really ties back to who originally had permits and who didn't, right? And so who was supposed to have permits, when all that go into place. And the real bottom line here is trying to just get phosphorus reductions from developed lands. And so, if we really do look at developed lands more holistically from like what's within the watershed, there may be better opportunities that are lower cost opportunities to get reductions from developed lands that may not currently be permitted. And I think that if there's this reassurance aspect that was trying to be met when when the state came back and said, we're going to suggest, pursuing 3-acre impervious surfaces as part of our reductions from developed lands. That came from DEC and the governor, that identified that in a letter back to the EPA in response to the 2014 TMDL or the 2012 TMDL response. I think there's an opportunity that, I understand why we look at what's currently permitted, but one of the complaints is that, we have developed lands for sitting right next to me that are 3 acres that never had a permit, but that doesn't mean we can't get reductions from those, in that those are still developed lands. And
Right.
there may still be a better opportunity. And so maybe it's just broadening that horizon, that lens a little bit.
Well, an unpermitted 3-acre site that's just one parcel, an unpermitted site with 3 acres of impervious, is a 3-acre site. I think, Christine, you're talking about the multi-lot developments, how that's where there's a distinction. If they had an operational stormwater permit that was pre-2002, they are a 3-acre site. And then you could look over the side of the hill and have a larger residential multi-lot development that was built in the 60s, and that's not a 3-acre site. So that is something that a utility could conceivably address, where, you know, you're, at least those folks are paying in. I think the logistics of trying to get multi-lot developments that have never had a stormwater permit, and in many cases might not have an association, would be, you know, to try to pull all those in under a permit would be challenging. Under utility, perhaps there could be different avenues to look at that, right?
That's what I'm going to, Terry. It's not so much for me. It's about looking, if you broaden the scope, right? And so right now you're looking to going back to like the permitted versus the non-permitted. Now it's not trying to pull those that were not permitted into a permit so much as looking at them as part of the watershed and saying, okay, EPA, we understand we have to get these reductions, this percent reduction from developed lands within this watershed. And, you know, currently our current approach has been to pursue existing permitted entities. But that what we're not doing is looking at those non-permitted impervious surfaces, and I think that we could find downstream opportunities, or like, you know, looking out downstream from those non-permitted developments, and we may be able to find reductions from those, and say we're going to get reductions from these impervious areas with these BMPs. And I think if you can show what your BMPs and tie them to impervious surfaces, you're showing how you're getting your reduction. I think it's been the state's approach to pursue existing operational stormwater permits because it's the easiest way to do it. It's the most direct way, and you have a legal ability to do that, to require improvements that'll reach those reductions. I don't think the EPA cares whether or not they're permitted entities or 3 acres or permitted developed lands or not. I think the EPA just wants justification and demonstration that you're going to get reductions from impervious surfaces or from developed lands. I'm just trying to change the color of the lens. That's how to approach this.
Mm-hmm. Should we?
The other equity piece that's hard, and I don't have an answer to it, but I do want to throw it out there, is, what do you do about the 3-acre sites that did come into compliance, that maybe did have a homeowners association? So if you're going to have a regional utility, you want them to get wrapped in as well, and you want them to get credit for the fact that they came into compliance. But again, maybe that's best addressed by having that utility figure out what's equitable within their fee structure. But I do think it needs to be addressed, or you kind of swing the opposite end of the pendulum in terms of equity.
Right. We do have that flagged, at least in the fee structure space, crediting for treatment.
If they have a functional and compliant system, maybe they get a reduced rate.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think a key to that is not only equity, but it also might support land access for a utility that's trying to find project opportunities. I mean, that's a crux of a carrot, that might otherwise have a closed door.
I have a question about the Green Schools Initiative, right? So that helps schools get all their stormwater in order?
Specifically their 3-acre permit obligations. And it's 67 in the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog basins. Schools that were subject to that.
And they all complied because it was fully paid for, I'm assuming, right? Is that?
They had a 10% leverage requirement, but it could be met with not necessarily cash, like different kind of educational opportunities for the kids as well. It was mostly funded with the Lake Champlain Basin Program funding that the state managed, and then patched together with some of the ARPA dollars too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does that seem to be very successful, right? I mean,
yeah, no, it's Yeah, it was very successful and it's hopefully closing out this year or next. But to be able to get, they're like the main 3-acre sites that we can demonstrate construction on because we know they've constructed because we're funding it. And we're replicating that model for the manufactured housing communities. We're working with the same vendor, doing the same level of like intense handholding and technical assistance to move those folks through 3-acre permitting as well.
It's been interesting for me because that's been my main lens of understanding 3-acre is because Lake Champlain Committee has been working on a project with one school district and being able to see that this, I mean, I think that the contractor who managed the process has been involved in our conversations about the educational project, and they just seemed like they did a great job with it. But again, you have an existing entity that wants to be in compliance, and you have, the school district and the school board and everybody else, and so it's very different from the orphan sites. But yet
And
it does seem like it's worked really well.
Well, and they're getting money to do it. So, a lot of money.
Yeah, I think it was about 36 million total.
Right, and they have the land. Most schools have a
And they
lot of
have the
open
land.
space.
Right,
Yeah.
And
they
that's
have the land.
one of the biggest constraints that I feel like most of these systems run into.
Yes.
Right.
It's not a matter of not wanting to be compliant or not wanting to clean up the lake. It's, are you going to take my land that I bought, that I own, and if especially if it doesn't exist, and if when the system already exists, and you want me to spend hundreds of million, or hundreds of thousands of dollars to make upgrades, it's a lot of money out of pocket. Yes, there is some money available, but I think it's difficult. I mean, I think there's a couple different lenses of inequity that we hear, in the conversations.
Yeah, and we 100% appreciate that all of these sites have different needs and different abilities to like meet the obligations. So the model that worked for schools and manufactured housing communities, it's just a different set of challenges for some other site. I do want to flag we've got about 15 minutes left, and if there's any prep, Terry, do you want to take us through to the end in terms of preparing for March?
Yeah, so we've got this draft outline, and do we have thoughts on the need or desire for another meeting? It doesn't need to be 2 hours, but prior to March 12th, which is the next committee meeting, do we want to allot some time to try to finalize, and again, this is still a draft, but a draft outline that we could have ready for the March 12th meeting? Is that
I feel like
sound?
we were asked to put one. Thanks, Harry. We were asked to come up with a draft. You're saying you have a draft outline there, Terry?
It was the same essentially that I had shared at the last meeting, and I think it's now posted online. And that was just a start, but we could refine that. And I think just to cover some of the specific things in Act 37 and the language regarding what they wanted us to do more specific to the permitting side of things, we might want to just note a few things related to, sites that don't have associations or upstream runoff from different properties coming in. Just refine that and have it in a good position to present to the committee on the 12th.
I think
Yeah,
we should have another meeting.
I have not had a chance to review that outline. I'd like to review it first and then come
Okay.
back and discuss it.
Does the let's say the 5th, the week, or is that not a good time? I'm just thinking Thursdays afternoon. Doesn't have to be a Thursday, but what do we think about?
Yeah, I would just have to hop off
Scheduling.
at 3:30 that day, but because I have another meeting,
Okay.
That works for me.
but I could be on for an hour and a half.
Okay. Jenny, thumbs up. Okay. All right, I can send an invite then. And we could make it 2 hours, and it doesn't again need to be, if we wrap it up sooner, that's fine too.
Could
So we
you-
can do that.
Could you attach that outline to, because I'm not seeing it here, so would you mind just
Yes.
attaching that outline, Terry? It'd save me a lot of time.
Yep.
Trying to dig for it.
Sure.
Appreciate it.
Yep, that'd be great.
Anything else we should cover logistics wise, Gianna? Anything for that?
Maybe
12th?
just in your next meeting, how to best bring this forward. I think we're all struggling a little bit. Like, I don't think all of our work groups want to just read through the outline in front of the rest of the committee. So what is the best use of our time with the full committee? Presumably we're sharing these outlines ahead of time. What are the highlights or the key things that like this work group wants to share out in terms of what you've been wrestling with, what your key questions are? I think that's would be worth distilling when you next meet in preparation for March.
Mhm. Okay.
Great.
Any
Thank
other
you.
questions or thoughts? Or we can certainly end 10 minutes early.
No, but appreciate everybody's time and conversation, and I know it's not easy. It's a complicated topic and a lot of different opinions. So
Appreciate all of
Thanks,
your
Christine.
time. Thanks,
And
everyone.
thank you.
See you, Gianna.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.